Hello and welcome dear students. Today we will be discussing Aristotle's classification of government. The objectives of today's lecture are: number 1, to know about who is Aristotle. Number 2, what is Aristotle's classification of governments? And finally, a critical evaluation of his classification of governments. A classification of regimes or political systems highlights similarities and dissimilarities between them, and by doing so it deepens our understanding of them. There is no end to the classification of political system, since every regime is at once unique and in flux. All classifications are therefore at best partial and temporary. As regimes exist in continuum, somewhere between total reliance on either persuasion or coercion, differing in the amount of power exercised and the way it is distributed, they do not fit nearly in rigid categories. Nevertheless, classification serves to highlight the major politically meaningful similarities and dissimilarities between regimes. Attempts to produce a classification of political systems can be dated back to the beginnings of the study of political science, to the days of ancient Greeks. The great Greek philosopher Plato had presented a classification of his own. Plato, in his book Republic, discussed about 5 types of states, which are monarchy, aristocracy, tyranny, timocracy, oligarchy and democracy. However, the novelty of Aristotle lays in the fact that he based his classification on the investigation of 158 constitutions existing in his day and offered a scientific and generally acceptable classification of constitutions or governments. In his book Politics, Aristotle divided the constitutions or governments into 2 classes: good and bad, or true and perverted. And in each of these 2 categories, he found 3 types according to whether the government was in the hands of one, few or many. His intention was not only to describe but to evaluate, and thus he extended his classification scheme to their perverted forms, which he labeled tyranny, oligarchy and democracy. He realized, however, that these types did not exist in their pure forms. Thus, noting that classification in political science is a search for ideal types, Aristotle, who is regarded not only the father of comparative political analysis but also of the classification of political systems. His classification is very important and has been followed by later thinkers who either modified it or criticized it. Dear students, let us know about who is Aristotle. Aristotle died in 322 BC. He was 62 and at the height of his powers, a scholar whose scientific explorations were as wide-ranging as his philosophical speculations were profound. A teacher who enchanted and inspired the brightest youth of Greece. A public figure who lived a turbulent life in a turbulent world. He best rode antiquity like an intellectual colossus. No man before him had contributed so much to learning. No man after him might aspire to rival his achievements. Of Aristotle's character and personality, little is known. He came from a rich family. He was allegedly a dandy, wearing rings on his fingers and cutting his hair fashionably short. He suffered from poor digestion and is said to have been spindle-shanked. He was a good speaker, lucid in his lectures, persuasive in his conversation, and he had a mordant wit. His enemies, who were numerous, accused him of arrogance. His will, which has survived, is a generous document. His philosophical writings are impersonal, but they suggest that he prized both friendship and self-sufficiency, and that while conscious of his place in an honorable tradition, he was properly proud of his own attainments. As a man, he was perhaps admirable rather than amiable. Aristotle was no recluse. The life of contemplation which he commends is not to be spent in an armchair or an ivory tower. He was never a politician, but he was a public figure and lived often enough in the public gaze. Yet, in the spring of 322 BC, he retired to Chorses on the island of Euboea, where his mother's family had property, and in the last month of his life, he lamented his isolation. The preceding 13 years he had spent in Athens, the cultural capital of the Greek world. There he had taught regularly in the Lyceum. He believed that knowledge and teaching were inseparable. His own researches were frequently carried out in company in a research team, and he communicated his results to his friends and pupils, never thinking of them as a private treasure store. After all, a man cannot claim to know a subject unless he is capable of transmitting his knowledge to others. And teaching is the best proof and the natural manifestation of knowledge. The Lyceum is sometimes referred to as Aristotle's school, and it is tempting to think of it as a sort of modern university. Timetables and lecture courses and a syllabus, the enrollment of students and their examination, and the granting of degrees. But the Lyceum was not a private college, it was a public place, a sanctuary and gymnasium. An old story tells that Aristotle lectured to his chosen pupils in the mornings and to the general public in the evenings. However, that may be, arrangements in the Lyceum were surely less formal than those of a university. There were no examinations and no degrees. There were no student fees and no student grants. There was none of that Byzantine bureaucracy without which no modern professor can teach and no modern student learns. Aristotle has been regarded as the father of political science, as he was the first to analyze critically and systematically the then existing constitutions and classify them. Aristotle went to Athens to study philosophy under the guidance of Plato. Plato was so deeply impressed by his talent, hence he called him the brain of his academy. Both Plato and Aristotle saw instability of the state as the major problems of the Greek city-states and held moral decline or anarchy responsible for this deplorable state of affairs. They held the view that the state comes into existence for the sake of life and continues for the sake of good life. However, Aristotle sought to build his philosophy on scientific foundation, while Plato had largely relied on speculative method. In other terms, Plato was an idealist and a radical, where Aristotle is a realist and a moderate. While Plato had combined all the branches of knowledge into a single system. In his prominent work, Republic, Aristotle sought to draw a distinction between different branches of knowledge. In Western tradition, before Aristotle, all branches of knowledge came within the purview of philosophy. Aristotle was the first to introduce the classification of knowledge and paved the way for their independent development. He not only laid the foundations of the science of politics, but made a significant contribution to its development, which is contained in his famous work, Politics. Now, let us briefly discuss his classification of governments. Aristotle was very concerned about the prevailing instability of government in his contemporary Greek city-states. So, he sought to develop a model constitution or government that would ensure political stability. Aristotle realized that different contexts will lead to formation of different types of states and governments. In Aristotle's writings, he has interchangeably used the words governments and constitutions. Therefore, here we are also using the term government and constitution interchangeably. Aristotle sent his disciples to various places for the purpose of preparing case histories of their constitutions. In this process, 158 case histories of various city-states were prepared, which were examined by Aristotle himself. On this basis, he produced his famous classification of governments or constitutions. His classification is based on two important factors. Number one is quantitative. The number of persons who exercise supreme power, whether a state is ruled by one, the few, or many persons. Number second is qualitative. The ends they seek to serve self-interest or benefit of the community, whether the ruler is devoted to interest of the state or to his self-interest. Aristotle differentiates several types of rule based on the nature of the soul of the ruler and of the subject. He first reflects on despotic rule, which is exemplified in the master-slave relationship. Aristotle thinks that this form of rule is justified in the case of natural slaves who lack a deliberative faculty and thus need a natural master to direct them. Though a natural slave allegedly aids from having a master, despotic rule is settled primarily for the sake of the master and only incidentally for the slave. Aristotle next considers paternal and marital rule, which he also views as defensible. For him, the male is by nature more capable of leadership than the female, unless he is constituted in some way contrary to nature, and by nature the elder and perfecter are more capable than the younger and imperfect. This sets the stage for the central claim of Aristotle's constitutional theory that constitutions which aim at the common advantage are correct and just without qualification, whereas those which aim only at the advantage of the rulers are deviant and unjust because they involve despotic rule which is inappropriate for a community of free persons. Aristotle's constitutional theory is based on his theory of justice, which is expounded in Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle distinguishes two different but related senses of justice, universal and particular, both of which play an important role in his constitutional theory. Firstly, in the universal sense, justice means lawfulness and is concerned with the common advantage and happiness of the political community. The conception of universal justice shapes the distinction between correct, which is just, and deviant, which is unjust, constitutions. But what exactly the common advantage entails is a matter of scholarly controversy. Secondly, in the particular sense, justice means equality or fairness, and this includes distributive justice, according to which different individuals have just claims to shares of some common asset such as property. Aristotle analyzes arguments for and against the different constitutions as different applications of the principle of distributive justice. The distinction between correct or normal form and deviant or perverted constitutions is combined with the observation that the government may consist of one person, a few, or a multitude. Hence, there are 6 possible constitutional forms. Aristotle's classification of governments can be described like this: number of rulers, correct or normal form of government, deviant or perverted form of government, one ruler, kingship, tyranny, few rulers, aristocracy, oligarchy, many rulers, polity, democracy. For Aristotle, the normal or correct form of government is where the ruler is devoted to interest of the state, whereas the deviant or perverted form is where the ruler is devoted to self-interest against the interests of the state. Aristotle discusses various forms of constitutions in his book Politics. There are 3 whose nature is correct or normal, namely kingship, the good rule of one man, aristocracy, the good rule of few, and republic or polity, the good rule of the majority. And 3 whose nature is corrupted or deviated, for example, tyranny, the perverted rule of one man, oligarchy, the perverted rule of few, and democracy, the perverted rule of the majority. This means thus that good political rule can take various and heterogeneous institutional forms, which produce thus different legitimate ways of solving the problem of sovereign authority within the city. In this theoretical scheme, even though kingship appears as the system that exhibits the most elevated concentration of power and whose monarchic nature would seem, at least on a first approach, counteract what is proper of the political organization of the city. The rule put into practice by a king is explicitly stated as a form of government as legitimate as that is found in an aristocracy or even in a republic. Since the principle that defines the essence of the genuine exercise of political power, the search of the common interest or of the public good, is entirely contemplated and preserved by it. Aristotle seeks to show how each of the right political regimes which we have discussed earlier, kingship, aristocracy and republic or polity, can be considered the best one if one examines the different social contexts and takes them into account the plurality of the political and moral circumstances. Aristotle defends kingship on two grounds. The first ground has a pure theoretical nature and bases itself on the argument according to which, being the main purpose of political life, the achievement of virtue, if in a city an exceptional political situation takes place concerning the emerging of a man of extraordinary or transcendent virtue, there is no other procedure to be adopted with regard to this outstanding man, but to grant him full powers, raising him above the law itself and instituting accordingly an absolute kingship. On the other hand, the second ground has a sociological and historical character and proceeds from the empirical verification of the fact that the absolute monarchical rule that exists in some nations and cities, exercised by an actual king entrusted with unfettered powers over every issue, is the most suited to the character of certain people and to the particular situation of some political associations. When rule of man deviates from common good and fulfills only one man's interests, then that system of government slips from kingship to tyranny, which is the perverted form of government. Regarding the constitution that's ideal, Aristotle is highly critical of the ideal constitution set forth in Plato's Republic on the grounds that it overestimates political unity, it holds a system of communism that's impractical and inimical to human nature, and it disregards the happiness of the individual citizens. In contrast, in Aristotle's best constitution, each and every citizen will own moral virtue and the equipment to carry it out in practice and thereby attain a life of excellence and complete happiness. All of the citizens will hold a political office and own private property because one should call the city-state happy not by looking at a part of it but at all the citizens. Furthermore, there will be a common system of education for all the citizens because they share the same end. The second best system typically takes the form of a polity in which citizens possess an inferior, more common grade of virtue. Polity is also seen as a mixed constitution combining the features of democracy, oligarchy, and, where possible, aristocracy, so that no group of citizens is in a position to abuse its rights. Aristotle claims that for city-states that fall short of the ideal, the best constitution is one controlled by a numerous middle class which stands between the rich and the poor. For those who possess the goods of fortune in moderation find it easiest to obey the rule of reason. They are consequently less apt than the rich or poor to act unjustly toward their fellow citizens. A constitution based on the middle class is the mean between the extremes of oligarchy, which is ruled by the rich, and democracy, which is ruled by the poor. That the middle constitution is best is evident, for it is the free from faction. Where the middle class is numerous, there least occur factions and divisions among citizens. The middle constitution is therefore both more stable and more just than oligarchy and democracy. Aristotle classifies democracy as a deviant constitution, although the best of a bad lot. The central claim is that the many may turn out to be better than the virtuous few when they come together, even though the many may be inferior when considered individually. For each individual has a portion of virtue and practical wisdom. They may pool these assets and turn out to be better rulers than even a very wise individual. Aristotle points out that to reform a constitution is no less a task of politics than it is to establish one from the beginning, and in this way the politician should also help existing constitutions. Aristotle also alerted to be cognizant of forces of political change which can undermine an existing regime. Aristotle criticizes his predecessors for excessive utopianism and neglect of the practical duties of a citizen. Dear students, let us now critically evaluate the Aristotle's classification of government. Aristotle's classification is unscientific and quantitative. It is argued that Aristotle's classification is not based on any scientific principle, as it lays emphasis on quantitative rather than qualitative aspect. Aristotle does not distinguish between state and government. Criticizing Aristotle's classification, Dr. Garner has said, Aristotle does not distinguish between state and government, with the result that his classification is the classification of states while it ought to be governments. Aristotle's classification does not cover all the modern forms of governments. According to Seeley and Leacock, Aristotle could not conceive the modern country states. His classification is of small city states and not of big states. If his classification is accepted, we shall have to place absolute monarchy, constitutional monarchy, elected and hereditary monarchy in one and the same category. This will bring similarity between the monarchy as it prevails in Saudi Arabia and Great Britain, while both are not the same. Besides, modern forms of government are parliamentary, presidential, unitary, and federal types. Aristotle's classification does not include and explain these forms of governments. Democracy is not the worst form of government. According to Aristotle, democracy is the worst form of government, and he has used it in the sense of a rule of crowd. This type of condition prevailed in Greece in Aristotle's time, but this is not the condition in modern times. In modern times, term democracy is used in a good sense, and it is considered to be the best form of government. Aristotle's cycle of change does not fit in the development of modern state. The cycle of political change given by Aristotle is applicable only to ancient Greece and Rome and not to modern states. Aristotle's classification is not applicable to theocracy. According to Blanchely, Aristotle's classification is not applicable to theocracy because in this type of government, the supreme power is attributed to God or some other superhuman being or an idea. The men who exercise authority are deputies of God on this earth. Aristotle's classification is also criticized for differentiating between aristocracy and oligarchy, while modern political thinkers do not attach any importance to this difference. It is also not possible to say where aristocracy ends and polity begins. Dear students, let us conclude today's lecture. Aristotle is one of the greatest of all the political philosophers, who is credited with being described as the father of political science, comparative politics, and biology. He has written almost on every aspect of human life, and that's why he is referred to as the most comprehensive thinkers. However, since we were concerned with his classification of governments, and as we discussed earlier, the classified governments or constitutions which he used interchangeably on the basis of quantitative and qualitative factors. Aristotle's main concern was to find out the conditions under which the status, whether normal or perverted, may enjoy stability. He held that the underlying cause of political strife and hence of revolution was inequality. Consequently, for him, the best state would have a form of constitutional government in which all citizens have access to at least some offices whereby they rule as well as are ruler. A constitution which in practice blends democratic and oligarchic features and in which the middle class is in control. For if the middle class, those who are neither rich nor poor and are sufficiently numerous, was to hold the balance of power, then the state will enjoy greater stability. This form of government was found in polity. It was the golden mean between the ideals of monarchy and aristocracy, which is difficult to obtain and sustain, and perversions of tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, which are undesirable. Despite so many criticisms, as we have discussed earlier, one must admit that Aristotle's classification is very novel and important as far as the various regime types in contemporary world are concerned. His classification proved to be the cornerstone for coming philosophers and their theories. In 16th century, for example, Jane Bodin worked on Aristotle's classification. With this, we have ended today's lecture. Thank you for listening to this lecture patiently. I hope you would have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.